Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Sinica Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us on today's podcast. I am just delighted to spend some time on this podcast with Tim Meyer. Today, I have known Tim for a few years and we met in the context of project management. And since then, he has become an Agile coach and is just active in our market, in our current space here in the Des Moines area as an Agile coach. And I am just really delighted in working with Tim and am excited to hear his story today. Tim, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here today.
Thanks. So, as you know, part of our format and the reason we do the Even Better podcast is to give people an opportunity to become even better at work. Maybe it's better at understanding their own skills and their own strengths and their own challenges. Maybe it's better at understanding how to work with others better or how to be a better contributor to a great work environment. And so I love the fact, Tim, that you've been willing to come on this podcast and spend some time talking to us about dyslexia and how that plays out in corporate America. Thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. It's something that, since I am dyslexic, it is something that is near and dear to my heart.
You bet. And let's start right there. Tell us a little bit about your story. You are dyslexic. How did you come to find that out? How do you know that? What's your story?
That's interesting. Nowadays, there is a little bit more knowledge about what dyslexia is and ways to find it within the schools. But unfortunately, I grew up in a small school in northern Iowa where I was never diagnosed with dyslexia. So I got it through the school system, and I just noticed that I really struggled with things. And not only did it lead to struggles, it led to, some interesting comments. I remember one time I was in a typing class, and I should let you know I'm old enough where I actually did my class on typewriters, not computers. And I can remember my typing teacher come to me one time looking at my results, and she goes, you better not ever get a job where you have to type for a living because you're going to starve to death. And at the time, I was like, well, why would you say that? I just didn't get it. I was struggling. I didn't understand why I was having all the problems. I did go and got some rudimentary testing where they were trying to figure out what was wrong. And I remember my Iowa basic skills, as a freshman in high school, I was able to score up as a freshman in college in my math scores, but my spelling and reading scores were down at a fifth grade level. So I kind of struggled with this all through school, just was considered an average person. No one really thought I was doing much until my senior year, and I took ACTs and ended up scoring considerably better than the valedictorian did. So which kind of led me with one of my teachers leading me to go into engineering because he said, I'd be really good at engineering. So it kind of led me to engineering school, ended up getting a bachelor's and master's in engineering and kind of started working through the academics, but I still had a few areas I struggled. I remember writing my master's thesis and I submitted my first copy of my master's thesis to my major prof. And I remember him looking at it and he quit marking it up at about page 20. And he said, this has got to be the worst thing I've ever read in my life. And so I kind of just struggled with that and didn't know what it was. So it got me into the working world and got into corporate America. I ended up working in an R&D department at a local company here in Des Moines, which was really good for my skill set. Didn't realize it at the time, but it was really good for my skill set, but still struggled with things. Until about 3 or 4 years ago, I was actually talking with a friend and was mentioning some of my problems. And they actually said, well, it sounds like you're dyslexic. And it led me to kind of dig into it, look at the kind of problems dyslexics have, what are the symptoms of it. And it was kind of funny. I found this checklist. I think it was about 15 items that dyslexics have. And it was literally yes, 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 all the way down the list, which kind of led me to getting formally tested. So I found an organization here locally and got it formally tested, which is an interesting process. It's about I think it's an 8-hour test. I did it over 2 days in order to actually test myself. So I've actually known formally here for about 2 years and been really digging into now, what does that mean? And what is dyslexia?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my story. It's been a story of ups and downs, highs and lows. A lot of times in corporate America, it's been kind of shunned and pushed around just because I didn't know what it was, and other people absolutely didn't know what it was.
You bet. And as I think about some of the stories that you and I have shared over the years and in our conversations, I know there are places where corporate America, for example, looks for accuracy in spelling and accuracy in, I'm thinking back of your typing teacher, which is just out of line for an instructor to say, but thinking about those challenges that you've continued to face and that you probably encountered in corporate America and in other places as well. So I love the overcoming that you've done in that. And I love in our conversations, the enthusiasm that you found that it's not just something to overcome. It's something that brings you a whole bunch of strengths as well. I'm looking forward to talking about. So when we think about dyslexia, I would say, Tim, you and I didn't grow up all that far apart. I had a typewriter in my high school typing classes, or at least my middle school typing classes. So we didn't grow up all that far apart. And I recall a stigma, if you will, or maybe a misunderstanding about what dyslexia is. And certainly it was not something that we talked about in the workforce. Maybe you can help educate us. When we think about 5 things people might not know about dyslexia, one thing I bet a lot of people don't know is, what is it really? So can you sort of educate us? What is dyslexia really?
Yeah, absolutely. I've looked up what the definition of dyslexia is, and it is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin, meaning that if you actually dig into the science, it's the way the brain develops. It actually develops differently than, and I like to use air quotes, what normal people would. It is just considered a neurodiversity. And it is characterized by difficulty with accuracy or fluency of words, particularly by decoding ability. Like, for instance, to give you the way my dyslexia works, if I look at a word, there are times I'm physically unable to actually decode the sounds with certain symbols. I might look at a U or an E or an ing, and most of the time I can figure out what that means. But there are times when it's just like my brain hits a brick wall. And it's like, I literally know what it is, but I can't pull it out. And it's also, I personally have a challenge because I actually have, in addition to dyslexia, I have a condition called dysnomia, which is also, it changes how quickly my brain can find specific information stored within it, which makes it challenge a little bit more about that. So that is kind of what dyslexia is. The other thing is that when you hear sounds, sometimes it's really difficult to distinguish the difference between them. Like, there are certain vowel sounds I can't really tell the difference with, whether it be, an A or an E, depending on how someone says it. I literally cannot hear the difference. And it's the way the brain is wired up.
Fascinating. Okay. I think this conversation right here, the idea that it's neurobiological in origin, and I think some of the science here is really interesting to some of our listeners. I know I was uneducated or certainly not aware of what dyslexia was. I think in my upbringing, it was just reading words backwards or, transposing letters. So talk to us about that. Many of us may have heard that sort of misdefinition of it. How does that play in to your experience with dyslexia?
That's a great question to ask. I mean, for me personally, I don't see letters backwards. Now, that doesn't mean I don't always write them correctly. It's kind of interesting. I always see them the way they are, but that doesn't mean I can necessarily write them the right way. And one thing that several dyslexics have a problem with is the difference between left and right. And that corresponds with writing letters incorrectly. Some of the other things that people have said is, dyslexics see letters bounce around. I don't.
Okay.
I don't see letters bounce around, but then I also don't read words based on the individual letters. The way I actually read is a word is kind of a picture almost. It is its own entity. For instance, we're talking about having a podcast here. Podcast would be one image for me, but the word pod is a completely different image, and they don't necessarily associate with each other. It isn't like it's a subset. Pod is a subset of podcast. They're completely different images. I view them as images. So one of the reasons why it's hard for me to notice between the different theirs is they're all the same, usually the same start, beginning, and length. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for me to see the different photos of them. Does that make any sense?
It does. It does. Thank you for that. So as we move into this topic, so 5 things people might not know about dyslexia. You've brought us through the sort of a definition of it and where it comes from. What are some of the challenges? So these are things that people might not know and might not have thought about. What are some of the challenges that people who are dyslexic experience?
Some of the challenges would be just basic reading and mispronunciation of words. I will actually read words incorrectly. Now, the bigger the phrases are, like if I'm reading a full paragraph, I can very easily figure out, oh, this is the context of it. But the shorter things are, the more likely it is that I'm going to misread it is. So like bulleted lists of words are really difficult. Short little statements on how you should do things like in order are very difficult. If you give me a big paragraph on context, that makes a lot more sense to me. And that has to go more into some of the strengths. So I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit.
No, that's great. Let me stop you there. So bulleted lists are difficult, or short statements are difficult. So I'm thinking about how this applies, right? Whether you are someone who has dyslexia and is trying to interact with others, or someone who is interacting with someone that you know to be dyslexic. So a challenge area is that your experience, for example, has led it to be challenging for you to read short bulleted lists, but easier for you to read context. Would that be consistent with, like, is there a broad sweeping generalization that one can make about dyslexia?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. And to jump into a little bit of the strengths, and I know we're going there. So, and this is part of the problem of being dyslexic. Part of the things that we see as dyslexics, because of the way our brain is wired, we see the forest much better than we see the individual trees. One of the big things is if you're working with a dyslexic, or if you're working with someone you believe is dyslexic, the why, the big picture is critically important. You have to paint the big picture first for the vast majority of dyslexics for them to understand. If you just say, okay, here's the 5 things I want you to do, it's basically you're giving us the individual trees, but we look at the whole forest. They're like, why does this make sense? I'm not going to remember them. And part of the other thing that is a lot of dyslexics have a little bit of problem with kind of the short-term memory. Having lists that they can refer to is good, but if you give them verbal lists, they won't be able to store as much in their mind as possible. And this is one of the things where it comes to corporate America, where people are so used to being able to deal with the short lists and those kind of things. It's not viewed as a, oh, you think differently. It is usually viewed as a, oh, you're just not as good as your neighbor.
Yeah.
It's really viewed as a negative.
I can absolutely see that that would be a challenge. So let's turn for a second to some of the hope there, the benefits of being dyslexic. As you talk about like seeing things as a big picture, that feels like that would be a tremendous strength. What are some of the other benefits of being dyslexic?
Seeing the big picture is one of the big things. And then seeing connections. One of the big things about seeing the big picture is seeing connections that a lot of other people don't see. Now, personally, I mentioned a little bit at the beginning that I worked a while in an R&D environment and why that was so good for me. As part of that, I was able to get about 10 US and international patents, because one of the things that I could really see is I could see, okay, these are how different things fit together in a way that no one else has ever seen it. So we're really big at seeing big picture. The other thing that is a great benefit, and although sometimes people see as a frustration, is since we're able to see big picture, we're also able to see patterns really well, both how things fit together and how things don't fit together. Like, for instance, I've worked with various projects, and I will worked in an environment where they wanted a specific way they wanted projects done. And I would come in, and just because of the way I could see everything going on, I would instinctively be able to say, oh, no, this way is not going to work well. This other way will work better. And I would start going down that road. So if given the freedom, you can actually create a lot of synergy with other areas where they can work better together. But unfortunately, what I have found is sometimes in corporate America, as a dyslexic, I can see that this is different. I can't always fully explain it to someone else because they don't have the ability to see the big picture.
Oh, I can see that. That's fascinating. So the ability to see the big picture, the ability to see patterns, the ability to see the way things connect, and perhaps to articulate, to at least see a better way, or a different way to approach something. Those are all benefits. And then they're offset just a little bit with the challenge of someone else saying, yeah, but you don't explain it in a way that I don't understand, or you don't follow the process the way everyone else does. This is going to move us to our third topic. What is it like to be dyslexic in corporate America? Corporate America does not seem structured to embrace and to love on people who are dyslexic. What has your experience been?
Well, so first of all, I want to cover a little bit of the research that I've seen. Some people have done some studies of dyslexia. And what they found is about 10 to 12% of the people in the world, in the US and in various places, are dyslexic. Now, if you look at entrepreneurs, that is about 30 to 40% of the entrepreneurs are dyslexic. But if you look at middle to upper management, the latest number I've seen is about 1%.
Wow.
So if you just look at the statistics, just ask yourself, okay, what is it about corporate America that is kind of intentionally or unintentionally? I mean, let's look at it however you want, but what is it about corporate America that is kind of making it so they can't succeed? So let me tell you a story about one experience I had in corporate America. I remember I was working at this research organization and I was working in my cube. And my director came in and stopped by my cube, and he was about 2 levels above me. And he said, Tim, I was wondering if you could do me a favor. And I'm like, absolutely. What can I do? He kind of looks at me, kind of shrugs his shoulders, sighs a little bit, and says, would you actually try proofreading an email at least once before you send them out? So I was sitting there just kind of dumbfounded. At this time, I didn't know I was dyslexic. I didn't know what it was. And just kind of wondering, what do I say to him? Because honestly, I knew I had a problem with emails, and I would literally read them 2 or 3 times before I sent anything out in the hope that I would catch everything. But I knew I wasn't going to. So I guess I would ask you, just think about this. If you were in this situation, if you were in this director situation, and this is what you thought about a person, that they're just lazy, they're just not really doing the work, are you going to consider that person a promotable? Are you going to consider really putting your time and effort into helping them grow? Also, are you going to have them, go out and be client facing, or kind of be the one who's going out and talking to other areas and representing where you're working? Looking back, it's like I can understand why I had the difficulties I did in that organization.
Absolutely. So first off, for an individual to make a flippant remark or whatever he was coming from on that, so wildly unacceptable. And I would hope that as we talk to our listeners and our listeners are thinking through this, not one of them would operate from an assumption of bad intentions or an assumption of laziness or an assumption of, someone else not pulling their weight. But even if we're operating from good intentions, I know that communication is important to us. And I know that putting accuracy and fluency in our communications is important. So for those of us who are in corporate America working with dyslexics and understanding that you are wonderful, right? The amazing people contributing, what words, obviously we don't say, could you try and proofread once in a while? What do we say? How can we be useful?
Oh, wow. How you can be useful. Well, I would say over the last several years, there has been a lot of tools that are now available. Like speak to text is huge. That is getting much more built into existing products like Microsoft. And one of the things that I have been so happy about is this product called Grammarly. And it is not just a spelling tool, it's a syntax tool. If you pay for the full version, it will know the difference between all the theirs. It will look at tenses like singulars and plurals. It will look at all these grammar things. And I literally have it installed on all my computers. I even have the Grammarly keyboard so I don't look dyslexic on my text messages. So, which sometimes is really kind of hard. The other thing I would say is just give people grace. Most of the people that are dyslexic, they know they have problems and they are working really, really hard on it. And it isn't something that you can work out of. It is something that's just innate in your nature.
That is really an interesting thing. As you think about dyslexia, it is not, let me make sure I understand you, it is not something that you work out of or recover from or get over. It is something that you learn to embrace and to live with and to then adapt as necessary depending on the tools available to you in the given circumstance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no way to cure yourself of dyslexia. I mean, it's literally the way your brain is wired.
That's amazing. I know that I was raised with the foundational principle that any learning impairment or learning disability, and at some point dyslexia was categorized as that in my childhood or my upbringing, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's how it was described. But any of them, you could just overcome it. You worked harder and you grew out of it, or you got better. And what you're saying is that's not the point.
No, I mean, it's literally something you can't work out of. I mean, it'd be kind of like someone that's 5'2" wanting to play in the NBA. I mean, how do you work yourself to 7 feet tall?
Yeah, what a great analogy. Thank you, Tim. So we've been talking about 5 things people might not know about dyslexia. And I know I, for one, am learning a lot. I hope our listeners are too. One of the things that's interesting that you brought up in our prep for this is a connection or a relationship between dyslexia and anxiety. Can you talk us through where you're coming from on that?
Absolutely. And what they have found is when they really talk to people with dyslexia, a vast majority of them have some level of anxiety. And the reason being is ultimately people who are dyslexic are regularly put into situations that they know that they struggle with. So like the analogy I try to use with people is, and this is a sports analogy, and I know a lot of people don't like sports analogies, and this is part of the reason why I want to use this. So think about this. Let's say you go to work on Monday and you show up for your 9 o'clock meeting, and all of a sudden there's a basketball and a set of tennis shoes there. And you said, okay, guess what? We're going to start playing basketball. This is how we're going to do this. And then you realize that everybody that's sitting in that room is not just your average players. I mean, they've played college ball. I mean, Division I college ball. Some of them are from the NBA. I mean, we're talking the best. And then you are asked not just to do this once in a while, but all the time. Every time. This is how we're going to compete. This is how we're going to show how we do things about this. Now, just think of the anxiety that you would have if you had to do this regularly. Now, let's say you decide, oh, crud, I can't do this anymore. I need to go somewhere else. And you find out every single organization out there does the same thing. Every single one of them. I mean, you can't ever get away from not playing basketball. Because as a dyslexic, we're not going to be able to find a job where you don't have to read and write.
Right.
I mean, that's just not the way it is. It just has a certain level of anxiety. And in fact, some of the studies show like 70 to 80% of people hide this from their employers. I honestly struggle with, should I tell people or should I not tell people? One of the things out there is this is an ADA protected status.
Okay.
There's a good debate on whether you should even let people know in job interviews because there is such a stigma. The latest studies show only 3% of the people out there actually see dyslexia as a positive. 97% of the people out there see this as a negative and a learning disability. Yep. And so they're not going to exactly say, hey, we're not hiring you because you're dyslexic. But it's a question of, do I even disclose it? What are they going to think? Do they think I can do the job? So, I mean, there's just ongoing anxiety in pretty much everywhere you're working, every place you go. And it shows that people with dyslexia actually have a higher level of anxiety than the general public. It's usually 2 to 3 times.
You bet. I think it would tie in as well to your point about the entrepreneurs. Using your basketball analogy, if day after day, job after job, you keep showing up in places where they're experts playing basketball and what you really want to do is something else. You go and you start your something else. You do it your own way. You do your own thing, right?
Exactly. And what's interesting? You can actually see out there are some famous dyslexics that are like CEOs of their organizations. The vast majority of them, they started it.
Isn't that interesting?
They did not grow through the ranks. They started it.
So would that be your counsel then for dyslexics in corporate America? Go start your own thing?
That depends on your level of risk tolerance. My wife owns her own business and it is not a easy road at all.
Sir.
So
Not so weak in heart.
So.
That's totally fair. So, Tim, this has been fascinating. So we've been talking about 5 things people might not know about dyslexia. I'm so grateful that you shared your story. And then we talked about, what is it really? And we've talked about some of the challenges, and we've talked about some of the benefits. We've talked about your experience as well as some of the research that you've encountered dyslexia in corporate America. And then a connection that I'm sure will be a surprise to many of our listeners on the connection between dyslexia and anxiety. Definitely something that we as listeners and we as fellow colleagues can use this information to be better citizens, right? We can work better with those around us. We can maybe shift that percentage from, if 97% of this see this as a disadvantage and only 3% see the advantages, maybe we can help educate those percentages and shift that a little bit so that fewer of us see dyslexia as a stigma or as something to be avoided or a problem to be solved, but rather embrace those opportunities of the big picture and the connections. I really love the fact that you've engaged in this conversation and we can start thinking about that. A question that I would ask you is a final question that I ask all of our podcast guests, and that is, what's making you even better right now?
What's making me even better right now? I would say with the dyslexia is 2 things. First of all, embracing it, realizing what I'm really good at, and then accepting who I am and accepting the help. There's certain things that I do try to write articles and stuff like that, and I just accept that I'm going to need people to help me proofread. That is one of the things. And I would say the second thing is I am trying to be more vocal about this to let people know that this is common. 10 to 15% of the population's out there. And by just sharing my story, I'm hoping that this might help someone else, especially if they're in the working environment. Someone hears this and realizes, here's what my story is, and thinks about, what? Maybe so-and-so is dyslexic. How can I work differently with them? So I would say that is how I'm. This is the funny thing about dyslexia. I talk about the short-term memory. I now forgot your question.
That is okay. You answered it beautifully. That's good.
So for those of you, and hopefully you don't cut this out, for those of you who are listening, this is the way it is. In the process of what I was thinking about, my short-term memory lost what the question was.
That's quite all right. So if, you've done some research and you've found some resources available, if anyone listening right now is seeking resources or looking for direction to either learn more about themselves, possibly discover if they are dyslexic and if there's something that they can do, some resources that would help them, or if you're working with someone who is dyslexic and you're looking for resources to help, where would you steer people to resources?
Oh, wow. If you jump on the internet, there's a ton of stuff out there. There's one site called madebydyslexia.org. They're really trying to promote what the benefits are. They've got some great stuff about 21st century skills and actually how dyslexics fill the need for 21st century skills better than the general population does, people who are non-dyslexic. There's the International Dyslexic Association. There's also an Iowa association. I can't remember what the name of it is right now, but I contacted them in order to find people that would actually offer formal dyslexia testing to me. So that's how I found a local organization in the Des Moines area to be able to be formally tested. So there's a ton of stuff out there. What I would say is try to find an association that's actually science-based, because there is a bit of misinformation out there, and just be careful.
Okay. That's good advice for all of us.
Yes. Just because it's on the internet does not mean it's true.
You bet. Tim, thank you so much for your time and your candor and your thoughtfulness in this. I'm really, really grateful for you.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad we could spend this time talking.
You bet. And thanks to all our listeners for being part of this conversation, and tune back in next time for the Even Better podcast.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.